Around the world, nations were falling under its influence, as the communist doctrine was injected into the bloodstream of their populations. In China, in 1949, the People's Liberation Army came to power, and thereby ended what they regarded as nearly 100 years of national humiliation that had resulted from having to sign detrimental peace treaties forced upon them by foreign powers. The People's Republic of China was created in October 1949, and its leader, Mao Zedong, said communism is a hammer which we use to crush the enemy. Mao had shown his willingness to crush the enemy during the fight for overall power of China when, during the siege of the city of Changchun in 1948, more civilians were killed than as a result of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. One of Mao's initiatives in the mid-1950s was the 100 Flower Campaign, a program that invited opinions on the running of the country. After a couple of months of the program, during which people felt empowered enough to speak out, Mao ceased it and had those he saw as opponents killed, a number that has been put in the millions. Even though Chairman Mao's policies went on to be responsible for the democide of an estimated 77 million people, Stalin wasted no time in forming an alliance with the new state, and the red flag flew over hundreds of millions of people around the globe as the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship was agreed. The Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship would end when Khrushchev came to power and fell out with Chairman Mao, whom he regarded as unstable and dangerous. As the aggressive policy of spreading communism continued, some countries would start new conflicts, such as in Korea in June 1950, when the Communist Democratic People's Republic of Korea, under Kim Il-sung, another tyrant that Stalin forged an alliance with, invaded the capitalistic South in an attempt to bring the country together as a single nation. Stalin agreed the planned invasion, expecting the South to come under communist control, but America, along with its allies, sent troops to deal with the rising red tide. As the forces fighting for the South repelled those from the North and actually crossed over the 38th parallel, China came to the rescue as Mao ordered Chinese forces into North Korea in October 1950. The war soon turned into one of attrition, with America turning to its air force to conduct a fighting and bombing campaign. One young lieutenant by the name of Buzz Aldrin would film the life and death struggle in the skies over Korea on his gun cameras as he shot down a MiG fighter. Eventually an armistice was signed in July 1953 to end the fighting, and the two countries were once again separated at the 38th parallel. With Kim Il-sung retaining his position as leader, a national narrative was fostered in which the people needed strong leadership and a strong military to counter the threat of any further American aggression. This narrative is founded in the terrible death and destruction visited on them by the US Air Force. Some estimates have put the North's death toll as high as 1.9 million civilians, with up to 85% of all buildings destroyed. America had suffered over 33,500 deaths, but it had once again showed that it would not stand by and see the peoples of a Western aligned nation become overrun by a communist state. As well as fighting communism overseas, the 1950s would also see America tackle the worldwide Soviet conspiracy from within, as the anti-communist witch hunts led by Senator Joseph McCarthy went after those with suspected Soviet sympathies. McCarthyism would blacken the name of many people, including Charlie Chaplin, Lucille Ball, Danny Kaye, Thomas Mann, Robert Oppenheimer and Edward G. Robinson. The backdrop for all of this hysteria was the increase in the capabilities of nations to wage war on each other. It was a time when obliteration by weapons 1,000 times more destructive than the one dropped on Hiroshima was just a way of life for the duck and cover generation. On the 29th of August 1949, the USSR tested its first atomic bomb, codenamed First Lightning, making them a nuclear superpower. With its detonation, conventional warfare between two nations ceased to be the ultimate expression of mankind's basest act against his fellow man. That distinction now went to nuclear warfare, and so began the nuclear arms race, as both sides built up increasingly frightening levels of weapons. With its nuclear supremacy now gone, America started to develop the terrifying new hydrogen bomb, which would successfully be tested on the 1st of November 1952. With nuclear destruction preventing direct war between America and Russia, the conflict between freedom and suppression moved from large-scale national military campaigns to acts of rebellion on the streets by the people being suppressed under Soviet control. It seems incredible now that the entire population of a nation can be subjugated by Soviet soldiers and tanks and cut off from the rest of the world by barbed wire and walls. Stalin had trapped millions of people in a prison of informers, secret police, midnight arrests, extreme interrogation, indefinite imprisonment, and a future with no hope. Family members told on family members, and suspicion was everywhere, and if the slightest sign of uprising was demonstrated, it would quickly and ruthlessly be put down. A perfect example of this dark new existence was seen in Hungary. The Hungarians were living under the harsh treatment of Stalin-approved dictator Matthias Rákosi, known as the Bald Butcher. It was clear that the population wanted to be rid of this control, but they were living under a regime that executed political opponents and imprisoned those who were believed to be disloyal to Stalin, a policy that resulted in 5% of the population being incarcerated in 1953. The Hungarians wanted their freedom, but there was one man in their way, but soon they would actively seize the chance to align themselves with the West. On the 5th of March 1953, Stalin died, and with it ended his iron fist control over the lives of millions. He was succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev, but if the death of Stalin had led some to believe that it might lead to the possibility of change, this hope was dealt a swift blow, as demonstrated in East Germany. Life in East Germany for the workers was getting to be impossible, with quotas extracting more work for no more pay. The Russians had wanted their pound of flesh in return for what the Nazis had done to their country. So while the Marshall Plan gave to the West, the Soviets extracted from the East. During June 1953, the East German workers rose up, with banners asking for fairer working conditions, more food and free elections, and for a brief moment the air was filled with optimism. But this was soon replaced by fear as the East German government asked for help from its Soviet puppet master. Soon 20,000 troops were on the streets of Berlin, suppressing the uprising, while the workers fought back with stones being used against tanks. With the brutal crushing of the mass rallies, President Eisenhower declared that the Soviets' response to the demonstrations were a good lesson on the meaning of communism. Arrests and executions followed the uprising, and the world had received a shocking display of what the response would be to anyone who tried to express free will within a communist-controlled state. For the East Germans, the 17th of June 1953 would hammer home the message that they were no longer a free people, and so if they couldn't get rid of their Soviet slave masters, they would remove themselves from the state, which they did in the hundreds of thousands as they escaped to the West. During August 1961, the division between East and West took on a physical presence when East German guards closed the border, first with barbed wire and then with concrete blocks to form the Berlin Wall. This was Stalin's solution to the hemorrhaging of the skilled labour fleeing communist rule. Since the end of the Second World War, 3 million people had fled from under the dense fog of fear that had descended on the East to the clear bright skies over the West before the border was closed. In the region of 150 people would lose their lives trying to cross from the East to the West. One of the first of these victims of the East German border guards was 18-year-old Peter Feska, who was shot and left to die in plain view on the 17th of August 1962. Crowds gathered on the west side shouting murderers at the guards in the east who left him to bleed to death. This willingness by ordinary men and women to risk their lives was a plain indication that communism stifled the individual's freedom, replacing free thought with indoctrination and free will with forced conformability to the will of the state. American tanks would stare down the barrels of Soviet tanks across the divide in Berlin in October 1961. This location would become the Cold War front line, where the US checkpoint Charlie braced itself against the chill from the east. This standoff would eventually come to an end and the tanks retreated to take up defensive positions. Ironically, this most divisive and despised symbol of the Cold War, demonstrating man's intolerance and inability to live in peace side by side with his fellow man, helped to contribute to the birth of mankind's greatest achievement. An achievement that was made in the spirit of peace, and one that would unite the people of the world like never before. During Apollo 11's post-flight world tour, the crew would visit Berlin in October 1969, where Michael Collins would describe the wall as the most depressing sight on our trip. The Cold War battle for Berlin would endure for many dark years, during which the East Germans would live in a climate of fear and suspicion, as the Stasi, using its network of informers, clamped down hard on their lives. Not until November 1989 would East Berliners be able to leave their communist enforced imprisonment and rejoin their fellow citizens on the western side. One small step 250,000 miles away would play its part in the journey that would eventually lead to the tearing down of Die Mauer. As the people of East Germany had discovered, any kind of reform in the countries behind the Iron Curtain was opposed, and so with nowhere to take their demands, they had taken their protests to the streets. As President Kennedy would say in 1962, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. East Germany would not be the last country to see its people rise up in their desire to rid themselves of Soviet control.